A police officer stops and assaults a young black man in front of a crowd that accuses him of stealing. Only after the police chief arrives does he realize he has made a crucial mistake. Subscribe and leave a comment on where you're watching this. The video shows how the fresh autumn breeze swept through the city park, making the scattered yellow and orange leaves on the grass crunch. Volunteers hurried to set up tables filled with food, blankets, and toys to distribute to needy families. It was the kind of event that reminded people of the power of kindness, a respite from daily routines to do something meaningful for the less fortunate. Michael Walker, 17 years old, moved agilely among the volunteers. His black hoodie bore the event's logo, and his warm smile soothed the children as he handed out toys and small backpacks filled with school supplies. Michael loved events like these. They gave him a sense of purpose, something that separated him from his identity as Jonathan Walker's son, the city's police chief. He believed in making a difference in his own way, without relying on his father's influence. Michael crouched beside a small boy holding a worn teddy bear, offering him a new one from the donation container. "Here you go, buddy. This one looks like yours, but it's better, right?" The boy's eyes lit up as he accepted the new toy, and Michael felt a wave of satisfaction. In those small moments, those smiles were why he enjoyed participating in his community. As the boy's mother expressed a grateful "thank you," Michael gave a quick nod before moving to help at the food station. The atmosphere was festive, with children playing tag near the swings and families gathered to receive their donations. Michael felt that day was good, and he was contributing to making it better. Not far away, Officer Bennett drove by in his patrol car, surveying the park with a hardened expression. Bennett had worked the streets for years and, in his opinion, teenagers loitering in public spaces couldn't be up to anything good, especially if they were black. Noticing Michael among the crowd, Bennett's instincts kicked in, mixed with prejudice and suspicion. Bennett slowed the car until he stopped at the edge of the park. From his perspective, Michael seemed out of place, dressed in a hoodie and sneakers, mingling with other teenagers Bennett had arrested in the past. He thought he couldn't be there just to help. Something on his belt caught his attention. Bennett got out of the car, adjusted his cap, and the patrol lights briefly flashed as he approached the tables where Michael was handing out food packages. As soon as Bennett got close enough to see Michael clearly, his suspicion turned into certainty. That kid must be involved in something shady. Bennett cleared his throat and advanced with his head held high, saying, "Hey," he shouted in a sharp, authoritative voice, "come here for a moment." Michael looked up from the pile of boxes he was sorting. At first, he thought Bennett might need help or some advice, but something in the officer's tone didn't sit right. The older volunteers nearby exchanged uneasy glances, sensing the tension. Michael hesitated for a moment, but then wiped his hands on his jeans and approached. "Yes, sir. How can I help you?" Michael kept his voice respectful, hoping the interaction would be brief. Bennett narrowed his eyes. "What's your name, boy?" "Michael Walker." "And what exactly are you doing here, Michael?" He gestured around him. "I'm volunteering, helping with the event, distributing food and toys." Bennett crossed his arms and leaned in closer, challenging. "So you're a volunteer. Do you think that's enough?" Michael felt the first flicker of discomfort, but maintained a courteous tone. "Yes, sir. I've been helping organize this for weeks, just trying to give back something." But Bennett wasn't listening. He had already decided what he wanted to believe. He thought that kid was probably using the event as a cover for something illegal. "Do you have anything in your pockets?" Bennett demanded, raising his voice. "Let me see your hands, Michael." Michael blinked, surprised by the sudden change in the officer's attitude, raising his hands to show his empty palms. "I have nothing, officer. I'm just here to help." But Bennett didn't stop. "What's in those donation boxes you're going through up there? Let me see what you've got." The cheerful bustle of the event began to fade as people noticed the confrontation. Parents brought their children closer, and volunteers exchanged nervous looks. Some passers-by discreetly pulled out their phones to record what was happening. Michael tried to stay calm, though his heart was pounding in his chest. "Officer, I promise I'm not doing anything wrong. I'm here with the other volunteers," Bennett said. "You're not, Michael. You look very suspicious. I bet you've been taking some of these donations." The accusation hit Michael like a punch to the stomach. Michael was too confused to articulate a word. "Why would you think I'd do something like that?" he thought as he took a deep breath. He insisted, "I'm not stealing anything, sir. Can you confirm with the event organizers?" But Bennett coldly replied that he didn't like his attitude. Michael looked around for support, but no one dared to intervene. Even the other volunteers remained still, unsure how to handle the escalating situation. A knot of frustration and fear tightened in his stomach. He did everything right, was polite and cooperative, but they treated him like a criminal. Bennett ordered him to put his hands on his head. Michael's heart sank. "I didn't do anything wrong," he repeated as Bennett, in a harsh tone, ordered him to turn around. The officer's hand was already reaching for the handcuffs on his belt. Michael knew that resisting would only make things worse, but the injustice burned inside him. He tried to speak, "Please, officer," but before he could finish, Bennett grabbed his arm and painfully twisted it behind his back. Michael let out a gasp, struggling to keep his balance as the officer forced him to the ground. The crowd murmured in shock, but no one stepped forward. The few recording the scene kept their phones steady, knowing that recording could be the only proof of what was really happening. Michael lay on the cold ground, his cheek against the earth as Bennett placed the handcuffs on his wrists. The metal dug into his skin, adding insult to the physical pain. Bennett murmured satisfactorily, "Let's see how you explain this to your friends." Michael closed his eyes, forcing himself not to cry. All his efforts to do the right thing, all his hopes of making a difference, meant nothing at that moment to Bennett. He only saw another black kid in a hoodie who was in trouble. The sound of children crying in the background echoed like a distant echo as Michael tried to calm his breathing. He didn't know what would happen next, but it was clear that a day that had started with so many promises had turned into a nightmare. Michael tried to steady his breathing as he lay on the cold, hard ground. The metal handcuffs dug into his wrists, filling him with disbelief and anger. How could a day dedicated to helping others turn into this nightmare? "I did everything right. I was polite, cooperative, and patient, but none of that mattered." The small crowd that had gathered watched in uneasy silence. Some were recording with their phones while others murmured among themselves, unsure whether to intervene or walk away. Parents held their children tighter, avoiding drawing attention. The lively atmosphere of the charity event faded, replaced by an uncomfortable tension hanging over everyone. Michael briefly looked up and made eye contact with an older volunteer who gave him a sympathetic gesture, but didn't dare intervene. No one dared to challenge the officer's authority. Fear of retaliation kept them paralyzed. Despite the obvious injustice, Bennett ordered Michael to kneel. "Kneel down." Bennett ordered again, roughly pulling Michael by the arm. Pain shot through his shoulder as the officer forced him to kneel. His weight was shaky and unstable. Michael tried to explain himself in a firm voice despite the panic he felt. "I'm not doing anything wrong," but Bennett's grip tightened. "Do you really think I'm going to swallow that?" "What kind are you?" the officer responded. Michael's heart pounded loudly. He wanted to scream that Bennett was wrong, but he knew any resistance would only make things worse. Suddenly, a voice was heard behind them. "Hey, you can't treat him like that," shouted a young woman with her phone held high, recording everything. "He's a volunteer. He hasn't done anything." Bennett turned sharply, narrowing his eyes. "Or are you joining him?" the girl warned. He hesitated but didn't lower his phone. "I'm recording this. Everyone will see what you're doing," Bennett mocked. "Yes, go ahead. Let's see how far that gets you." He pushed Michael, making him fall onto his hands and knees. "Why are you doing this?" Michael whispered, almost inaudible, more to himself than to Bennett, as a helpless frustration built inside him. A nearby child started crying, clinging to his mother's hand. "Mom, why is the police hurting him?" The mother murmured something comforting, but her eyes were fixed on Michael, filled with worry. Bennett grabbed Michael's arm, pulling him up. Again, he forced him to stand. Now Michael struggled to stay upright with his hands cuffed behind his back. The metal cutting into his skin, his muscles aching, but the humiliation was even worse. He could feel all eyes on him, every judgment. His chest tightened with a mix of shame and helplessness. The officer pushed him toward the nearby patrol car. "Come on, let's take a little walk." Maybe we'll find out what you're really doing. Michael twisted his neck to look back at the crowd, hoping someone would say something, do something, anything, but no one did. An officer didn't move, desperate. Michael tried one last time to find a reason to prevail. Just ask the organizers. They know I'm volunteering here. I didn't steal anything. You should have thought about that before acting like an idiot, Bennett snapped with his voice full of coldness and disdain. As Michael approached the car, his knees scraped against the gravel, causing intense pain in his legs. He gritted his teeth, refusing to scream. He wouldn't give Bennett the satisfaction. The murmurs in the crowd grew as more people began to record. Michael saw the volunteers huddled, whispering about what to do. Some were visibly distressed, wanting to intervene but paralyzed by fear. A voice in the crowd shouted, "He's not a criminal. Stop this." But Bennett ignored them. His mind was already decided. Trapped in a narrative he had created the moment he saw Michael, a suspicious black teenager who didn't belong. Then the breaking point came. Michael tripped again with his fists, painfully tugging at his wrists. By reflex, he turned his shoulder to avoid falling, lightly grazing Bennett in the process. It wasn't intentional, but Bennett took it as a challenge. That's it, Bennett. Resisting an arrest now really gets you in trouble. Before Michael could react, Bennett forcefully pushed him against the side of the patrol car, slamming his chest against the cold metal. Michael's head snapped back in shock, his vision blurred. For a moment, the pain radiated through his ribs and a strangled cry escaped his lips as a wave of nausea washed over him. As the officer immobilized him against the car, Bennett shouted, "You're hurting him." Bennett's radio crackled with static as a voice came through the channel. "What's the problem?" "A hostile suspect is here," Bennett growled into the radio, ignoring the truth that Michael had been compliant from the start. Michael collapsed against the car, struggling to breathe, his mind wondering how this was happening. He was there to help make the day brighter for others, and now was on the verge of being arrested for something he didn't do. Out of the corner of his eye, Michael saw a new patrol car stop, and two officers got out, scanning the scene with concern. One of them, a younger officer, recognized him immediately. His eyes widened in shock. "Wait," the younger officer murmured to his partner. "What's that, Michael Walker?" "Chief Walker's son." The other officer frowned. "Are you sure?" "Yes, that's him," the younger officer confirmed, nervously looking toward Bennett. "We need to stop this." However, Bennett was too engrossed in his rise to power. Noticing the exchange, he pushed Michael harder against the car, tightening the handcuffs unnecessarily. The younger officer took a cautious step forward. Bennett, he anticipated this. "Boy, he's Chief's son." Bennett froze. For a moment, his eyes flickered with disbelief. "That's Michael Walker," the younger officer repeated urgently. "Now we can't do this. Chief Walker will give us a lesson." But Bennett, stubborn and full of pride, dismissed the warning. "I don't care who his father is. Boys act suspiciously, and I'm doing my duty." The younger officer exchanged a nervous look with his partner. "Understand," he said. "If we don't stop now." Before he could finish, another car stopped in the park. The crowd, sensing something significant was about to happen, moved restlessly. Murmurs grew as the car door opened and Jonathan Walker stepped out. He was dressed in civilian clothes, but carried the unmistakable air of authority. The police chief approached the scene, his face a mask of calm, but his eyes burned with controlled fury. He had seen his son on the ground handcuffed like a common criminal and was now there to resolve the situation. Jonathan Walker's expression was unreadable. To his son, Michael, handcuffed and immobilized against the patrol car, Michael looked up and met his father's eyes, feeling a mix of shame and relief. He didn't need to say anything. His father could see everything in his expression: humiliation, disbelief, and the sting of betrayal by those who were supposed to protect him. Jonathan stopped just meters away from Officer Bennett. His cold, piercing gaze triggered the handcuffs that Bennett had ordered in a low but authoritative voice. Bennett, still clinging to his ego, hesitated for a brief moment. "Sir, this boy was acting," Bennett began. Jonathan Walker narrowed his suspicious eyes, and the tension between them seemed to rise. "Let go of that boy, he's my son," he said to Bennett. The younger officer, feeling that disobeying was a dangerous option, quickly stepped forward and unbuckled Michael's handcuffs. Michael made a slight grimace as he felt the pressure lessen, rubbing his sore wrists, but remained silent. Bennett's expression shifted from smug certainty to understanding that he had made a catastrophic mistake, and it was now too late to undo it. "I didn't know," Bennett murmured, suddenly unsure of himself. "That's the problem," Jonathan replied evenly, his gaze fixed. "I didn't know. If you didn't care to find out that you saw a black teenager and assumed he was a criminal." Bennett swallowed hard, the weight of his actions bearing down on him. He felt uncomfortable under the sharp gaze of the man he was supposed to answer to. Realizing that this was much worse than anything he had anticipated, the crowd that continued to watch began to murmur louder. Several passers-by had already uploaded videos of the incident to social media, and notifications were buzzing on their phones as the footage spread like wildfire. Jonathan turned to Michael, his expression softened. "You're hurt." Michael shook his head despite his throbbing wrist and aching ribs from the rough handling. "I'm okay," he whispered. The pain in his voice wasn't physical. Jonathan placed a hand on his son's shoulder to steady him, and then turned to Bennett. "What you did today was unacceptable." Bennett opened his mouth to speak, but Jonathan interrupted him. "I don't want excuses. I want your badge now." The younger officer's eyes widened, and Bennett's face paled. "You're suspended. An investigation will determine what happens next." But from that moment on, Bennett was done. Fumbling for his badge closure, he took it off his uniform with trembling hands and reluctantly held it out, but Jonathan didn't take it. He gestured to the younger officer, who would take Bennett and escort him back to the station. "I'll handle the rest." Bennett's face twisted with a mix of fear and resentment, but he didn't argue. The younger officer took him by the arm, guiding him toward the patrol car as the crowd began to disperse. Justice is being served, at least for the moment. Once Bennett was out of sight, Jonathan turned to Michael with a fixed gaze. "Come on, son. Let's take you home." Michael hesitated. "What about the event?" "I don't want to hear it like this." Jonathan's expression softened, but there was still a hint of sadness in his voice. "We'll take care of that right now. You need to rest." Michael reluctantly allowed his father to guide him to the car as they walked. Whispers and murmurs followed them, but Michael kept his head held high, knowing he hadn't done anything wrong. However, the pain from the incident lingered, and he knew no matter how much he tried, his father would fix things. Some wounds would take longer to heal. That night, the video of Michael's arrest quickly spread on social media. A few hours after being captured, thousands of views were shared across numerous platforms. The media picked up the stories, beginning along with hashtags condemning police brutality and racism. Protests were already being organized in front of the police station. Michael remained silently seated at the kitchen table, his hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had long lost its warmth. The events of the previous day replayed over and over in his mind like a bad dream he couldn't escape. He had gone to the park with the intention to help, only to be humiliated and treated like a criminal. His father, Jonathan Walker, stood before him, leaning against the kitchen counter with arms crossed, his face reflecting a mask of contained anger. As police chief, he had witnessed many things throughout his career, but nothing had prepared him to see his own son treated that way. "You know we have to fight against this," Jonathan said softly, breaking the silence. "Michael," you didn't respond immediately. He directed his gaze to the cup, struggling to understand his emotions: anger, sadness, shame, and exhaustion in a constant whirlwind. "I don't know if I want to fight," Michael admitted. "Finally, I just want to forget what happened." Jonathan crossed the room and sat beside his son, placing a firm hand on his shoulder. "I know how you feel, son, but we can't ignore this. What happened to you happens to kids like you every day. If we stay silent, nothing will change." Michael sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It feels so unfair. I did everything right. I was polite, cooperative, and still it wasn't enough." Jonathan nodded slowly, perfectly understanding his son's frustration. "I know, and that's exactly why we have to speak out right now." Michael's phone vibrated on the table. It was a text message from one of his friends linking him to a news article about the incident. Below the article was a video of the arrest. His arrest had already gone viral with millions of views. The headline read that the police chief's son had attacked due to an apparent racial profile. Michael stared at the screen with his stomach tied in knots. He had never wanted this kind of attention. He wasn't seeking to be a symbol or a cause. He just wanted to help at a charity event, and now he was in the middle of a spiraling controversy. "What do I do now?" he whispered, more to himself than to his father. Jonathan gently squeezed his son's shoulder. "Tell your story, tell people what happened, and make sure this never happens to anyone else." The words were easier said than done, but Michael knew his father was right. As painful as it was to remain silent, he would only allow the problem to continue if he couldn't use his experience to shed light on the injustice others faced. So maybe something positive could come out of this. The sound of the doorbell interrupted the conversation. Jonathan stood up and walked to the front door, opening it to reveal a small group of journalists standing on the porch, microphones in hand. Behind them, protesters were already starting to gather on the sidewalk with signs demanding justice for Michael. Jonathan stepped out, raising a hand to address the journalists. "There will be a statement later today," he said firmly. "Right now, my family needs some time." The reporters reluctantly stepped back, scribbling notes and taking photos before turning to the growing crowd of protesters. Jonathan closed the door and leaned against it, letting out a slow sigh. Michael watched from the kitchen, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on him. The world outside his house was demanding answers, and he knew he couldn't avoid them forever. That afternoon, Jonathan called a meeting with his superiors to discuss the incident and the steps forward. Michael listened from another room as his father presented a plan for internal reforms, mandatory bias training, stricter racial profiling policies, and a new oversight committee to review complaints against officers. "We have to do better," Jonathan told his officers with a firm but convincing voice. "What happened yesterday was unacceptable, and it won't happen again, not under my watch." Michael felt a spark of hope. Hearing his father's words, maybe, just maybe, this could be the start of real change, but the road ahead was still uncertain. He knew there would be violent reactions defending Bennett's actions, while others would accuse him of using his father's influence to avoid consequences. The fight for justice was never easy, but it was a fight worth pursuing. That night, Jonathan held a press conference in front of the police station. He stood at the podium, flanked by senior officers, and addressed the crowd of journalists and protesters. "As many of you know, an incident occurred yesterday involving my son and one of our officers," Jonathan began with a calm but firm voice. "What happened was unacceptable, and I want to make it clear that no one is above accountability, not even myself." The crowd murmured in approval, and cameras flashed as reporters took notes. "I have initiated a full investigation into the incident," Jonathan continued. "Officer Bennett has been suspended pending the results of that investigation. In the meantime, we are implementing new measures to ensure this never happens again in our department. We will conduct mandatory training on biases and create an oversight committee to handle misconduct complaints." Michael listened attentively as his father spoke, feeling a mix of pride and nervousness. This is not just about him, but about all the young people who face discrimination every day, kids who didn't have a police chief for a father, Jonathan added. "And now," Jonathan said, turning slightly towards his son, "I'd like you to say a few words." Michael's heart raced as he stepped forward with sweaty palms and a dry throat. He had never spoken before to such a large crowd, but he knew this was his chance to make a difference. He took a deep breath and approached the podium. The crowd fell silent, waiting for him to speak. "My name is Michael Walker," he began, feeling his voice tremble but focusing. "Yesterday, I was arrested at a charity event where I was volunteering. I was accused of stealing and treated like a criminal, not for what I did, but for who I am." He paused to let his words sink in. "No one should have to go through what I went through," he continued, gaining confidence with each word. "That's why I'm here today, to ensure this never happens to anyone else. We all deserve to be treated with respect and dignity, no matter who we are or how we look." The crowd erupted in applause, and Michael felt the wave of emotion swell in his chest. For the first time since the incident, he felt like he had regained some control, as if he had turned his pain into something meaningful. Jonathan stood beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder, and together they faced the crowd, united in their fight for justice. The road ahead would be long and there would be challenges along the way, but Michael knew he wasn't alone. For the first time in a long time, that gave him hope. If this video has helped you connect more with yourself and inspired you on your growth journey, take action and subscribe to the Vidas Inspiration channel to discover more stories that will fill you with motivation and hope. I'd love to hear your thoughts, so leave a comment telling me how this story has impacted your life or what reflections it has left you with. And if you think this message can inspire someone you know, share it with your friends so they too can find inspiration and purpose in their lives.